Today's story is about a South Carolina lake cabin, a homeowners association president, and a surprise guest who changed everything. Trevor Gaines had spent most of his adult life in the relentless rhythm of the city. Every morning he woke to the buzz of traffic echoing between glass towers, and every night he returned home to a skyline of blinking lights and endless construction. He was a successful project manager at a large engineering firm, someone who had climbed the ladder through grit and long hours, but success had left him exhausted. The phone calls never stopped, emails rolled in at midnight, and the stress began to seep into his health. Friends told him he needed a break. His doctor recommended he find a space to disconnect. Trevor, who had always loved the outdoors and remembered fishing trips with his grandfather, started browsing properties far from the city's sprawl. After months of searching, he found it, a modest but charming cabin tucked along a quiet South Carolina lake. It wasn't luxurious, it was wooden, weathered and surrounded by towering pines, but it felt right. The lake was glassy and still, reflecting the sky like a mirror at dawn. Birds cut across the water, and in the evening the frogs sang. The cabin sat on a narrow road lined with only a handful of other homes, far enough apart that you could sit on the porch and hear nothing but nature. For Trevor it was a refuge, a place where he could slow down, clear his head, and reclaim some peace. He envisioned early mornings on the deck with coffee, evenings reading by the fireplace, and weekends where his nieces and nephews could come out to fish and learn about the outdoors. More than a retreat, the cabin represented a chance to reconnect with the parts of himself that city life had dulled: patience, stillness, and self-reliance. He poured his savings into the purchase, knowing it was an investment not just in property but in his well-being. The community around the lake was older, mostly retirees and long-term homeowners. They waved when he drove by, though some gave curious glances. Trevor introduced himself politely, eager to fit in without making waves. He kept the cabin neat, replaced rotting boards on the porch, and planned a few small improvements, like repainting the trim and adding a small dock for his canoe. It was important to him to respect the area's character. He had no idea that behind the friendly greetings and quiet coves, the local homeowners association kept a close and sometimes heavy-handed watch on every property along the shoreline. The lake community fell under the governance of a homeowners association known officially as the Palmetto Shores Property Owners Committee. On paper it was designed to maintain common areas, organize neighborhood events, and ensure that property values stayed high. In reality, its reputation was very different. Residents spoke of letters slipped under doors about minor infractions, fines for leaving kayaks visible from the road, and warnings over things as small as planting the wrong flowers. At the center of it all was Judith Carroway. She had been president of the HOA for nearly a decade, a position she treated less like a volunteer role and more like an elected office. Judith prided herself on upholding standards, a phrase she repeated at every meeting. Tall and silver-haired, she moved with the air of someone used to command. She had a binder for every property, a list of every covenant, and she personally drove through the neighborhood several times a week with a clipboard to note issues. Many residents complied simply to avoid trouble. They mowed their lawns twice as often, painted their fences the approved shade of beige, and kept gathering small. Those who questioned the rules sometimes found themselves receiving letters citing obscure clauses. One family who installed solar panels without prior approval was fined until they removed them. Another homeowner, an elderly widow, was warned about a non-compliant garden gnome on her porch. Judith saw these measures as necessary discipline. Critics called it intimidation. The association's history of enforcement wasn't evenly applied either. Some longtime friends of Judith seemed to skate by with visible violations, while newer or younger homeowners bore the brunt of the scrutiny. Whispers about favoritism spread, but few dared to confront her directly. Judith was known to show up with sheriff's deputies when homeowners resisted, a tactic that left people feeling powerless. Her hold over the board was tight, and few challenged her decisions publicly at meetings. When Trevor bought the cabin, Judith's attention soon shifted toward him. She noted his renovations, even the smallest ones, and sent form letters asking for details on his permits. He responded promptly, providing paperwork and following procedures, but the scrutiny didn't let up. To Judith, Trevor represented yet another outsider who might lower standards. To Trevor, it felt like harassment thinly disguised as oversight. Neighbors whispered warnings about how far Judith would go. What Trevor didn't know yet was how deeply this culture of aggressive rule enforcement ran, and how one unexpected afternoon at his cabin would bring it all into the open. Trevor had been in the cabin only a few weeks when the first envelope arrived. It was a plain white letter with the Palmetto Shores Property Owners Committee seal printed on the corner. Inside, typed neatly in formal language, was a notice informing him of a potential violation, regarding the color of his trim and the placement of his canoe rack. He read it twice, puzzled. The trim was the same pale gray it had been when he purchased the cabin, and the canoe rack was hidden behind the porch, barely visible from the road. He shrugged it off at first, thinking it must be a mistake or a routine check sent to all new homeowners. 2 weeks later, another letter arrived. This one addressed the unauthorized outdoor furniture on his deck. Trevor stared at the line referring to 2 wooden rocking chairs he had bought from a local craftsman, the same style many other cabins display. The tone of the letter was sharper, hinting at fines if the matter wasn't resolved promptly. Trevor took photos of his deck, walked the road to see how others arranged their porches, and sent a calm reply with evidence attached. He expected an apology or at least clarification. Instead, a third letter came citing excessive noise during a weekend visit from his nephews, despite the fact that they had simply grilled hot dogs and played soft music at sunset. The letters began to feel less like oversight, and more like a message. Trevor couldn't ignore the pattern. He noticed other homeowners with colorful furniture and loud weekend gatherings, who didn't seem to receive similar warnings. He also couldn't ignore the glances, neighbors who paused mid-wave, the subtle lowering of voices when he walked by. As a black man in a mostly white, older community, he began to feel the weight of scrutiny that went beyond property rules. He had dealt with microaggressions in corporate boardrooms, but here it was creeping into his supposed sanctuary. He started keeping a file. Every letter, every photograph, every interaction he documented carefully. It wasn't paranoia, it was self-protection. He called the HOA office to discuss the issues, and was directed to speak only with Judith Carroway. The conversations were polite but clipped, with Judith repeating phrases about community standards and uniform enforcement. Trevor asked for copies of the covenants, and studied them late at night, highlighting the passages that proved his compliance. Still, the letters kept coming, each one more formal than the last, each one hinting at escalation. Friends urged him to sell the cabin, to avoid the stress, but Trevor was determined not to be pushed out of a place he had legally purchased and carefully maintained. He loved the smell of pine after rain, the ripple of fish under the dock, the quiet mornings when mist rose off the water like a veil. He wasn't about to lose that to what felt increasingly like targeted harassment. His professional background taught him to stay calm under pressure, to prepare his case meticulously, and he did just that. What he didn't know yet was how much deeper the tension ran within the HOA itself, and how his quiet documentation was laying the groundwork for a confrontation no one in the neighborhood had anticipated. From Judith Carroway's perspective, the new cabin owner was a test of her authority. She prided herself on noticing details other people missed: a non-standard mailbox, a boat dock extended 6 inches too far, a fence painted the wrong hue. When Trevor moved in, Judith made notes almost immediately: the replacement boards on the porch, the fresh paint on the window trim, the talk of a small dock. In her mind, these weren't innocent improvements, they were potential breaches. She believed firmly that if she let one homeowner slide, the whole community would spiral into what she called chaos of non-compliance. Judith's house sat on a hill overlooking part of the lake, giving her a clear view of who came and went. From her kitchen window she could see Trevor's driveway. She noticed the contractors arriving to drop off supplies, the weekends when friends visited, the new rocking chairs on the deck. Each sighting went into her notebook, each notebook entry a future point on an agenda. She attended every HOA board meeting armed with photographs and printed regulations. She quoted section numbers from memory, her finger tapping the paper as she spoke. In her conversations with the deputies who occasionally accompanied her on enforcement visits, she cast herself as the guardian of the neighborhood's value. She talked about how outsiders didn't understand the rules, how city people thought they could do whatever they wanted, how standards had to be protected at all costs. To her, Trevor's renovations were not just aesthetic changes, but a potential crack in the dam she had built over the years. She repeated to anyone who would listen that he had not submitted proper forms, even though his permits were on file with the county. Some of the other board members were uneasy with her approach. They whispered about her obsession, about the way she singled out certain homeowners, but Judith's confidence and long tenure made challenging her uncomfortable. She framed every action as necessary for the good of the community. In meetings she held up photographs of Trevor's porch as evidence, circling areas with a red marker. She wrote letters late at night, printing them on official HOA letterhead so they carried more weight. In her mind, Trevor's presence threatened to unravel the order she had spent years enforcing. She didn't see him as a professional man looking for peace. She saw him as someone testing boundaries, someone who might embolden others to defy her.
Her conviction hardened as weeks went by. Each new improvement at his cabin became another item on her list. Another justification for what she believed had to be a direct intervention. She told allies on the board that she was preparing to handle the situation personally, that she would make an example if necessary. As the tension built, Judith began framing her notes as a case file, a record she could present to deputies or even county officials. She believed she was on solid ground, enforcing the rules as written, but in her determination she overlooked the broader context. The optics of a white HOA president bearing down on the only black homeowner on the street, the quiet buzz among neighbors about her heavy-handedness, and the fact that Trevor had a far stronger ally at his table than she could have imagined. Her certainty about his violations became the driving force behind a confrontation that would soon step far outside the usual bounds of neighborhood dispute.
On a humid Thursday afternoon when the sky hung low and gray over the lake, Judith Carroway set her plan in motion. She had spent the previous evening assembling a thick folder of documents, photographs of Trevor's porch, printouts of HOA bylaws, copies of warning letters she had already sent. Her handwriting in the margins marked out violations she was prepared to cite. Judith believed this was not a casual visit but an enforcement action, something she had framed in her own mind as necessary to maintain control. She put on a crisp linen blouse and her pearl earrings, the ones she wore to county commission meetings, and dialed the sheriff's office. The deputies who arrived at her driveway that afternoon were used to accompanying Judith on these sorts of calls. They had walked beside her before when she demanded to see a homeowner's building permit, or insisted that an unauthorized boat be removed from a dock. Most of the time the situations ended quietly, with homeowners nodding and promising to comply. This time she requested 2 deputies instead of 1, explaining that she anticipated resistance. She gave them a brief rundown of her version of events, that a homeowner had made unapproved changes and was ignoring HOA directives. She used firm language, presenting it almost like a law enforcement matter rather than a civil dispute. The 3 of them drove slowly along the narrow road toward the lake cabin. Judith sat in the passenger seat, folder on her lap, rehearsing what she would say. In her mind she pictured Trevor opening the door, surprised to see her flanked by uniformed officers, and immediately backing down. She was counting on the presence of the deputies to add weight to her words, to make it clear that the association's authority could not be brushed aside. She told herself this was simply procedure, that she was protecting property values and the integrity of the community. As they approached the cabin, the atmosphere shifted. The smell of pine and damp earth filled the air. A few neighbors watched from their porches, curious at the sight of a county patrol car easing down the lane. Judith noticed curtains move as people peered out. She felt a surge of resolve. This was her chance to show the neighborhood that rules still matter. She gathered her folder, smoothed the papers inside, and stepped out of the car. Her shoes crunched on the gravel as she walked up the path toward the front door with the deputies a step behind. From the outside the cabin looked calm, almost idyllic. A soft light glowed through the window. On the deck those same rocking chairs sat neatly side by side. Judith's pulse quickened, but she forced her face into its usual mask of polite authority. She raised her hand and knocked sharply, 3 times, loud enough for anyone inside to hear. The deputies flanked her, 1 on each side, their expressions neutral but watchful. Judith held her folder like a shield, ready to launch into her speech about compliance and consequences. The moment the door opened. Inside the cabin, Trevor sat at the oak dining table he had refinished himself, a steaming mug of coffee beside a stack of papers. Across from him, leafing through documents with a measured air, sat the State Attorney General of South Carolina. The 2 men had been discussing a pilot program on community mediation and fair housing practices, a professional interest of Trevor's from his work in urban development and his volunteer efforts on civil rights issues. They had met before at conferences and had struck up a correspondence. When the Attorney General learned Trevor had a place on the lake, he offered to stop by for a quiet working lunch away from the press and the Capitol's noise. The cabin had been filled with the low murmur of their conversation, punctuated by the clink of coffee cups and the scratch of pen. Papers spread across the table detailed case studies of HOA disputes, enforcement disparities, and emerging legal standards on property owners' rights. Trevor had explained the issues he'd been facing with his own HOA as an example of how small-scale governance could sometimes slip into overreach. The Attorney General listened carefully, asking pointed questions, making notes. It was meant to be a private, candid meeting, no press, no staff. Just 2 professionals thinking through how to make local regulations fairer and less prone to abuse. The knock at the door cut through the calm like a hammer on glass. Trevor paused mid-sentence, eyes flicking to the window. Through the lace curtain he caught sight of Judith Carroway standing stiffly on his porch, flanked by 2 uniformed deputies. A ripple of disbelief ran through him. He had received letters before, but this was different. He rose slowly from his chair, every instinct telling him to keep composed. He glanced at his guest, who raised an eyebrow but said nothing, his posture alert and curious. Trevor walked to the door, his footsteps measured. He had been documenting everything, anticipating some form of escalation, but he hadn't imagined this exact moment. His hand closed around the doorknob as the knocking came again, sharper this time. He opened the door just wide enough to step into the frame, keeping his voice even. The cool air from outside brushed against the warmth of the cabin. He saw Judith's determined expression, the folder in her hands, the deputies standing slightly back but clearly present. He heard murmurs from the neighboring houses, the faint sound of a phone camera clicking. Inside the cabin, the Attorney General shifted in his seat, catching a glimpse of the scene at the door. He could see the posture of the deputies, the stiff shoulders of the HOA president, the tension hanging in the doorway. He closed his folder but didn't rise yet, choosing instead to watch how the first moments played out. Trevor introduced himself calmly to the deputies, asked the reason for the unannounced visit, his tone professional but edged with incredulity. Judith began to launch into her rehearsed list of alleged violations, her words spilling over one another in her rush to assert control. The contrast between the two worlds, Judith's belief that she was confronting a rogue homeowner and Trevor's reality of sitting with the state's top legal officer, hung in the air like static. The smell of coffee still drifted from the table inside. The Attorney General could hear every word being spoken at the threshold. The deputies glanced between Judith and Trevor, their eyes flicking toward the interior of the cabin as if sensing that the situation was not what they had been told. In that moment, the cabin, once Trevor's private sanctuary, became the stage for a collision of authority and rights. Judith's voice, the deputy's silence, Trevor's measured calm, and the unseen presence of the Attorney General only a few steps away, created a tension that was about to unravel the carefully constructed order of Palmetto Shore. The man at Trevor's kitchen table was not a neighbor, not a contractor, but the state attorney general himself, dressed in a plain blazer instead of a suit, quietly leafing through legal briefs and sipping coffee from a mug. Trevor had handed him early. He had come to the lake under the radar for a working lunch, eager to hear firsthand about the tensions homeowners faced with overreaching associations. The setting was informal, but his presence carried the weight of the state's highest legal office. A calm authority seated amid the pine scent of a modest cabin, a stark contrast to the image Judith had painted of a non-compliant homeowner, hiding infractions. Judith had rehearsed her tone to sound commanding, certain Trevor would shrink under the sight of her folder and the deputy, perhaps apologize and promise immediate corrections. Instead, as her eyes adjusted to the cabin's interior, she caught sight of the Attorney General rising slowly from his chair, his badge of office resting in plain view on the table beside neatly stacked papers. The quiet authority in his presence disrupted her script. The balance of power she'd counted on tilted instantly. The deputies glancing at one another as they realized the homeowner they'd come to pressure was sitting with the state's chief law enforcer. As Judith began reciting her list of supposed violations, the Attorney General stepped forward from the kitchen table, his calm voice cutting through the tension. He introduced himself to the deputies first, showing them his identification, then turned his attention to Judith. Without raising his tone, he asked her under what statutory authority she was entering a private residence with law enforcement for a civil covenant issue. His questions were precise, legalistic, and direct. Whether she had a warrant, whether due process had been afforded, whether the HOA bylaws even permitted on-site confrontations without prior notice. The deputies shifted uneasily at his word, realizing they had been drawn into something that might not hold up under scrutiny, and Judith's prepared speech began to falter as the focus turned from Trevor's alleged infractions to her own. While the exchange unfolded on the porch, the quiet lane outside had transformed into a curious crowd. Windows opened, screen doors creaked, and a handful of neighbors stepped into their yards, phones raised discreetly at first and then openly, as they realized something unusual was happening. The sight of uniformed deputies and the HOA president at a homeowner's door had always been gossip fodder, but now the presence of a tall stranger with an air of authority drew even more attention. Camera lenses caught the Attorney General's badge glinting in the afternoon light, Judith's stiff posture and Trevor's composed expression. The whisper of "Is that who I think it is?" passed from one person to another as recording dots blinked red, creating a digital record of the confrontation that would later spread far beyond the lake community. When Judith had first stepped onto the porch with her folder of papers and 2 deputies at her side, she had been a picture of confidence. Her shoulders were squared, her chin slightly lifted, her voice crisp as she began outlining the alleged violations she claimed to have documented. She gestured with her folder like a gavel, pointing at the porch boards, at the chairs, at the path leading to the dock. But the moment the Attorney General stepped forward from the kitchen, introduced himself calmly, and began asking about legal authority, the air around her changed. It wasn't immediate humiliation, it was a slow unraveling of the control she thought she had. Her prepared lines began to stumble. Instead of issuing demands, she found herself explaining. She tried to keep her tone even, insisting that the HOA had clear covenants and that Trevor had ignored them, but the words came out thinner now, almost apologetic. Her eyes darted from the Attorney General to the deputies, and back again, measuring their reaction. She clutched her folder tighter, her knuckles whitening, and the rehearsed speech she had carried in her head dissolved into scattered sentences about standards and community expectation. The power dynamic she had counted on, uniformed officers behind her, a homeowner in front of her, was no longer there. Each time the Attorney General asked a pointed question, such as, "Do you have judicial authorization for this visit?" or "Has your board voted on this enforcement action?" her voice dipped lower. She began backtracking, saying she was just here to discuss rather than to enforce, reframing the encounter as a conversation rather than an intervention. The deputies who had been silent at first were now standing a little apart from her, arms crossed, glancing at each other as if reconsidering their role. Judith's posture softened, her chin lowered. She started looking at Trevor rather than over him. The neighbors' phones capturing every moment added to her unease. She had always controlled the narrative in board meetings and newsletters, but here on this porch, with a state official questioning her and cameras watching, she could feel the story slipping away from her. She tried to smile, a tight smile meant to signal composure, but it looked more like strain. Her sentences turned to hedged phrases. "I believe to my understanding, perhaps we should," instead of the definitive statements she had practiced. Even the deputy's body language told her the weight of the encounter had shifted. They no longer looked like her backup, but like neutral observers waiting to see what would happen next. Every second that passed eroded the authority she had brought with her, leaving her voice thinner, her gestures smaller, and her certainty leaking away like air from a punctured tire. The two deputies who had accompanied Judith were veterans of small-town disputes. They were used to noise complaints, loose dogs, minor accidents, and occasionally being asked by the HOA president to stand by while she delivered a warning. Usually those encounters were brief and uneventful. Homeowners grumbled but complied. Judith left satisfied, and the deputies went back to their patrols. This time, from the moment they stepped onto the gravel drive, something felt different. The air had a tension they couldn't quite name, a sense that the normal script wasn't going to play out. They had been told by Judith that a non-compliant homeowner was ignoring repeated notices, and that their presence would ensure civility. But when the door opened and they saw Trevor's composed expression and then noticed the tall man inside rising from the table, they exchanged a quick glance, an unspoken signal of caution. When the Attorney General introduced himself, showing his identification and asking them about the legal basis for the visit, both deputies instinctively straightened. They had trained to recognize the chain of authority, and here was the state's top legal officer standing inside a private residence, questioning their involvement in what, on paper, was a civil covenant dispute. The older deputy shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his hand resting loosely near his belt, but not on it. The younger one tilted his head slightly, eyes narrowing, as he replayed in his mind the call that had brought them here. They realized they had no warrant, no complaint filed with the sheriff's office, only Judith's insistence that HOA rules were being broken. As the Attorney General asked Judith about her authority to enter the property and about the board's vote, the deputy's role began to feel less like peacekeepers, and more like pawns in a dispute that might not be theirs to enforce. They noticed the phones of the neighbors recording from across the street, the glint of camera lenses aimed at their uniform. They were trained to de-escalate, to stay within the law, and the presence of the state's chief law enforcement official made every movement, every word feel like it could be scrutinized later. They took small steps back from Judith, creating a subtle gap that signaled neutrality rather than solidarity. Their questions to Judith became quieter, almost hesitant. "Ma'am, do you have the paperwork with you? Is this an HOA matter or a criminal matter?" They weren't challenging her outright, but trying to understand their own footing. The older deputy asked Trevor softly if there was any disturbance or if he needed assistance, his tone markedly different from the usual clipped authority of such visit. Trevor replied calmly that he was fine and that the Attorney General was his guest, which only deepened their unease. In their minds they weighed the optics. A white HOA president, accusing a black homeowner of violations without clear authority, two deputies present, without a warrant, the state Attorney General watching and questioning everything. They could almost hear the news headline forming. Their training told them the safest path was to step back, observe and not act unless a clear criminal issue arose. The younger deputy moved his hand away from his belt entirely, clasping it behind his back to show he wasn't about to intervene. The older one nodded slightly to the Attorney General, a silent acknowledgement of his status, and of their own awareness that the line between civil enforcement and overreach might have already been crossed. As Judith's voice shifted from commanding to defensive, the deputy's posture shifted too. No longer standing squarely behind her, they angled their bodies toward the driveway, a subtle but unmistakable sign that they were reconsidering their position. They glanced at each other more frequently now, reading each other's unease. Every question from the Attorney General: do you have judicial approval for this action? Has this homeowner been afforded due process? Tightened the coil of doubt in their mind. They realized they were not simply present for a minor rule violation, but participants in a moment that could have legal repercussions for everyone involved. The deputies, who had been brought to add weight to Judith's presence, were beginning to feel the weight shift onto themselves, aware that the safest thing they could do was retreat into strict professionalism, observe carefully, and avoid becoming instruments of an HOA's overreach. Within hours of the tense scene at Trevor's cabin, the story began to ripple across Palmetto Shores like a stone dropped into still water. The neighbors who had been filming from their porches uploaded short clips to social media groups and messaging threads, the kind of informal channels residents used to swap recommendations for plumbers or share lost and found notices. At first the posts were cryptic, a few grainy still shots of Judith standing stiffly at Trevor's door, the deputies in the background, a suited man partially visible inside. But as more angles surfaced, the picture sharpened. The state attorney general himself was in the frame, his identification clearly visible in one video, his calm voice heard questioning Judith about her authority. By nightfall the neighborhood's private Facebook page lit up with comments. Some longtime residents, loyal to Judith, wrote that the HOA was just doing its job, and that Trevor must have been violating some rule. Others, especially newer homeowners, voiced shock and anger at what they were seeing, calling it harassment, wondering aloud why deputies were present for what appeared to be a civil matter. Local bloggers who tracked community issues picked up the clips and began weaving them into posts, with headlines like HOA showdown on the lake, and Attorney General confronts HOA president. Friends and family members of residents shared the footage further afield. The once sleepy HOA meeting hall became the subject of memes, commentary, and speculation. People who had never paid attention to neighborhood politics suddenly wanted to know what was going on at Palmetto Shore. Even residents who hadn't witnessed the scene directly heard about it before the next morning. Text chains buzzed with details, half-truths and rumors. Judith had tried to evict Trevor on the spot. Trevor had called the Attorney General himself to set her up. The deputies had threatened to arrest someone but backed down. Each retelling added drama. The only consistent facts were the images: Judith's rigid posture, Trevor's steady demeanor, and the Attorney General's quiet authority at the table. This digital wildfire stripped away Judith's usual control over narrative. In the past she could send an official HOA email summarizing an incident in her own language, but now video clips with sound were circulating beyond her reach. Residents compared notes, slowed down the footage, analyzed who said what. They began recalling their own experiences with the HOA, small moments of intimidation or selective enforcement that had seemed isolated at the time but now, in light of the confrontation, looked like a pattern. Those who had once felt alone in their frustration realized others shared. Private messages between neighbors turned into group chats. Former residents who had moved away chimed in with their own stories, adding to a growing informal archive of grievances. What had been an internal dispute between a homeowner and an HOA president was becoming a community-wide conversation about fairness, power and the limits of authority. Meanwhile, the larger public began to take notice. A small local news station sent a reporter to knock on doors near the lake. They found residents eager to talk, some on record, others off, about the culture of fear around Judith's enforcement tactics. A few people still defended her, saying strict rules protected property values, but even they were startled by the image of deputies standing on a homeowner's porch over porch chairs and paint colors. The contrast between the minor nature of the alleged violations and the heavy presence of law enforcement, plus the Attorney General's surprise appearance, gave the story a hook. It wasn't just a neighborhood squabble anymore. It was a symbol of something larger, and the public wanted to know more. As the footage spread, so did memories. People who had once lived at Palmetto Shores but moved away started posting long comments on the videos, or sending messages to current residents. They described letters written in sharp, almost threatening tones over small issues like mailbox placement or seasonal decorations. One man recounted
How Judith had shown up at his door with a deputy over a fence he had built a few inches higher than allowed. A young couple wrote about being fined repeatedly for clutter when their only offense had been leaving their toddler's toys on the lawn for a weekend. An elderly widow recalled being warned about her non-compliant rose bushes, and feeling humiliated when she had to dig them up under Judith's watchful eye. These stories poured out across platforms, painting a vivid mosaic of life under the HOA's rigid regime. Patterns emerged in the testimonies. People who were new to the neighborhood, people who didn't fit the prevailing demographic, or those who had publicly questioned board decisions, were far more likely to receive warnings and fines. Longtime friends of Judith, or those who kept their heads down, often escaped scrutiny for similar or worse infractions. Residents began to compile these accounts into shared documents, mapping incidents across years. It was no longer just anecdotes, but data, dates, letters, photos, building a case in the court of public opinion. Local journalists seized on these revelations. Articles quoted former residents describing a selective crackdown and a culture of intimidation. Civil rights advocates began to comment on the posts, noting how easily private associations could slide into discriminatory or abusive practices without oversight. Even some HOA board members, who had kept quiet during Judith's tenure, started to leak emails and meeting notes, anonymously, revealing that they had raised concerns internally, but been ignored or pressured to stay silent. For current residents, these stories were both vindicating and unsettling. Many had tolerated Judith's tactics out of fear or resignation, believing their experiences were isolated, or that resistance would only make things worse. Now, reading a chorus of similar accounts from people who had already left, they saw the pattern clearly. Group chats turned into planning sessions. Some discussed calling a special meeting to challenge Judith's leadership. Others floated the idea of legal action. The sense of isolation that had kept people compliant was dissolving into a sense of collective grievance. Trevor watched this unfold with mixed emotions. He had not asked for a public spectacle, but the attention was lifting a curtain he had felt pressing against him since the first letter arrived. His careful documentation of every warning, every conversation, was suddenly relevant to more than just his own defense. Neighbors reached out to him privately, thanking him for standing firm, sharing their own letters and photos. The confrontation at his cabin had become a catalyst. What had begun as Judith's attempt to enforce standards on one homeowner had ignited a reckoning across the entire community, drawing in voices from past and present, turning isolated frustrations into a movement that questioned the very foundation of how their neighborhood had been governed.
By the second morning after the confrontation, the story had outgrown neighborhood gossip. One of the short clips taken on a neighbor's phone had been reposted on a local journalist's Twitter feed, with the caption, "Attorney General confronts HOA president at Lake House." That tweet went viral in the region, drawing hundreds of comments within hours. The journalist followed up with a short article on the website of a mid-sized paper, explaining the basics of what was known: a black homeowner in Palmetto Shores, repeated warnings from an aggressive an unannounced visit by its president with deputies in tow, and the surprise presence of the state's top legal officer. Readers who had never heard of the Quiet Lake community clicked through in disbelief. The article was shared by television reporters and radio hosts, and by the afternoon crews with cameras were driving out to the edge of the lake to knock on doors. On evening broadcasts, anchors spoke over blurred footage of Judith on Trevor's porch, and of the Attorney General's ID glinting in the light. They framed it as a question of civil liberties and racial bias, wrapped in the everyday world of homeowners associations. Has local power gone too far? Is there a pattern of selective enforcement? Even outlets, usually focused on lifestyle or real estate, began covering it, because the story had the texture of a drama: a picturesque lake, a powerful but obscure HOA president, a homeowner documenting harassment, and a state official stepping into the picture. It wasn't just news, it was a narrative about power at the smallest level. Call-in radio shows opened their lines for people to share their own HOA stories. Some callers from across the state described similar intimidation from neighborhood boards, some sympathetic to Judith's desire for order, but disturbed by the heavy-handed tactics. Social media amplified the outrage. Civil rights groups reposted the footage with captions about due process and equal treatment. Real estate forums debated whether restrictive covenants had gone too far. The Attorney General's office declined to comment officially, but confirmed he had been at the cabin on a pre-arranged visit, which only deepened the intrigue. Commentators speculated that he might be preparing to investigate the HOA or even propose new legislation. By the weekend, national blogs that specialized in everyday injustice stories had picked it up, framing Palmetto Shores as a microcosm of how unregulated homeowner power could collide with civil rights. The photographs of Trevor's quiet cabin became symbolic images online, paired with headlines about a battleground over property rules. Judith's name trended locally, as people searched for her record. Public outrage was not uniform. Some defended strict HOAs as necessary to protect investment, but the dominant tone was disbelief that 2 deputies could be used to enforce porch furniture rules, and that it took the Attorney General's presence to push back. The narrative of a small community quietly governed by fear and now thrust into the spotlight resonated far beyond South Carolina. For the residents of Palmetto Shores, the influx of cameras and journalists was surreal. Trucks with satellite dishes parked along the narrow road. Reporters interviewed neighbors on their lawns. Some residents hid behind curtains. Others came out eagerly to speak. The HOA office tried to issue a statement about maintaining high standards, but it was drowned out by the stream of testimonials pouring into comment sections and call-in shows. Judith, once the unchallenged gatekeeper of the community, found herself a recognizable figure on the evening news, her photograph paired with captions about controversial HOA tactics. The story had moved from porch confrontation to statewide conversation, and with it came a sense that something larger was at stake than one homeowner's fight. As the media attention grew, scrutiny from officials followed. Journalists who started with simple interviews began filing public records requests, asking the county for complaints and citations linked to Palmetto Shores. Civil rights attorneys offered to review residents' letters and fines pro bono. Within days, a small team from the Attorney General's office, not just the man himself but staff investigators, was quietly collecting documentation. They compared Trevor's warning letters with those received by other homeowners. They looked at HOA board minutes, enforcement logs, and correspondence. Patterns began to emerge in spreadsheets. Who was cited for what, and how often? The data told a story residents had only suspected. Homeowners who fit a certain profile, new to the neighborhood, younger, people of color, or those who had questioned Judith at meetings, received a disproportionate number of warnings and fines. Others, often longtime residents who socialized with Judith or served on committees, were rarely cited despite visible infractions. In some cases, identical actions produced opposite responses. One resident fined for having a small garden shed, another allowed a full boathouse without a permit. Investigators also found instances where Judith had used deputies to accompany her without any documented board vote authorizing such action. Reporters published these findings in a series of articles titled, "Rules for Some," and "Behind the HOA Curtain." Charts showed the disparity. Residents read them, and saw their suspicions confirmed in numbers. Former homeowners contributed their own files, copies of letters, photographs, even audio recordings of tense conversation. A clearer picture formed of a pattern that was not just personal vendetta, but systemic bias, shaped by Judith's power and the board's complicity or silence. The revelations went beyond embarrassment. They raised legal questions about discrimination and abuse of authority under state law. For many in the community, the publication of these findings was both vindication and a call to action. People who had once avoided public meetings began attending. They demanded transparency in enforcement, and a review of all fines levied under Judith's tenure. Some neighbors organized a petition to remove her as president, citing the data as evidence of misconduct. Others contacted state legislators about reforming HOA laws to include oversight and limits on enforcement tactics. The story shifted from one man's dispute to a blueprint for how unchecked local power could harm ordinary people. Judith tried to defend herself through carefully worded statements, saying she applied rules uniformly, and that any appearance of bias was coincidental. But emails leaked from board members told a different story. Internal discussions about keeping standards up when certain families moved in, notes about needing deputies present for problem owners. These fragments, when published, painted a portrait of selective enforcement that no press release could erase. The deputies who had accompanied her began cooperating with the inquiry, explaining they had acted on her requests and had not been briefed fully on the civil nature of the dispute. The impact spread beyond Palmetto Shores. Other HOA boards in the region quietly reviewed their own practices, worried they might be next. Civil rights groups held community forums on homeowners' rights. Local politicians cited the case as proof that state law needed to change, proposing bills to restrict how HOAs could fine or involve law enforcement. Trevor's careful record-keeping became a model. He shared copies with investigators, and encouraged neighbors to do the same. The unfolding inquiry showed how a single confrontation could peel back years of opaque practices, revealing not only one president's tactics,
but a system that had allowed them to flourish without accountability. As each new article appeared, more residents and former residents came forward, their stories filling the gaps in the data with human detail. Missed mortgage payments from unexpected fines, children frightened by uniformed officers on their doorstep, retirees selling their homes out of exhaustion from constant warning. The evidence of selective enforcement was no longer anecdote or rumor, but a documented pattern being examined at the state level. What had started as a moment on a porch was now a case study in how small-scale authority could cross into abuse, and how shining a light on it could mobilize an entire community and a wider public to demand change. In the weeks after the revelations, the atmosphere inside Palmetto Shores shifted from cautious curiosity to open rebellion. Once quiet neighbors who had avoided HOA meetings packed the clubhouse, until people spilled out onto the deck, holding their phones high to record every word. They weren't just venting, they were arriving with binders of evidence, screenshots of warning letters, spreadsheets comparing fines and lists of signatures calling for immediate changes. Some stood up to describe how they had felt intimidated for years, speaking in measured voices that cracked under the weight of long-suppressed frustration. Others demanded votes to suspend Judith's enforcement powers, and to audit all penalties issued under her leadership. Even residents who had once defended her began to distance themselves, worried about the growing media coverage, and the potential for legal action. The board, used to rubber stamp meetings, now faced pointed questions about budgets, bylaws, and why deputies had been involved in minor disputes. Under the glare of cameras and notebooks, they struggled to maintain composure as one motion after another for transparency, oversight, and new elections landed on the agenda. Each session felt less like a neighborhood gathering and more like a hearing, and the pressure built daily as more people joined petitions, threatened lawsuits, and contacted state officials. As the protests against the HOA gained momentum, Trevor found himself at the center of a movement he had never planned to lead. He had moved to the lake cabin for quiet and privacy, not headlines or speeches, yet neighbors now looked to him as proof that standing up could make a difference. People approached him at the grocery store to thank him, slipped notes of support under his door, and asked how they could help. Formerly isolated households began connecting through him, organizing carpools to meetings, sharing documents, and coordinating statements to investigators. Reporters requested interviews, advocacy groups invited him to speak on panels, and his image appeared in articles about homeowners' rights. Though uncomfortable with the attention, he realized that telling his story gave others courage to tell theirs. He began keeping an open folder of resources for anyone facing unfair enforcement, guiding them on how to document incidents and file complaints. What had begun as a personal defense against a barrage of citations evolved into a rallying point for the entire neighborhood. His calm demeanor during the initial confrontation, replayed thousands of times online, became a visual shorthand for persistence without aggression, and his willingness to keep detailed records offered a template for collective action as more residents stepped forward with their own evidence and voices. As the investigation deepened and residents' testimonies piled up, the Palmetto Shores case stopped being treated as an isolated controversy and started being framed as a catalyst for reform across South Carolina. Lawmakers who had initially commented only in vague terms about monitoring the situation began holding meetings with staff attorneys to review the state's homeowner association statutes, realizing how little oversight existed for these powerful but private organizations. Committee hearings in the State House opened with clips from the cabin confrontation, playing on large screens, illustrating how a handful of rules about porch furniture could escalate into a constitutional question about due process. Advocacy groups representing homeowners, civil rights organizations, and even some real estate professionals testified about the lack of transparency, the ability of HOA boards to levy fines without neutral review, and the use of law enforcement as an intimidation tactic. Draft bills were circulated that would require all HOAs to register with a state agency, file annual enforcement reports, and give homeowners an independent appeal process before any fine or penalty could be enforced. Another proposal sought to limit the circumstances under which private associations could involve police, restricting them to criminal matters only. Legislators cited Palmetto Shores repeatedly as evidence of why these reforms were necessary. Reporters began describing the package of bills as Trevor's Law, even though Trevor himself had not lobbied for them. Editorial boards of major newspapers endorsed the proposals, calling the confrontation a wake-up call about unaccountable governance hiding in plain sight. Meanwhile, the Attorney General's office prepared a civil action against the Palmetto Shores HOA for discriminatory and abusive enforcement practices, naming Judith personally in the complaint. They sought restitution of improperly collected fines, injunctive relief to stop further selective enforcement, and the appointment of an independent monitor to oversee the board until new elections could be held. The complaint cited not only Trevor's case, but dozens of others uncovered during the investigation. It alleged a pattern of conduct that violated state consumer protection and fair housing laws. For residents who had felt powerless for years, the filing was a vindication. For HOAs across the state, it was a warning that business as usual might now carry legal risk. Coverage of the lawsuit and the bills created a feedback loop. More homeowners from other neighborhoods came forward with their own stories. Lawmakers added stronger provisions to the reform package, and media outlets framed South Carolina as a test case for national change. Legal scholars wrote op-eds, explaining how private governance can cross constitutional lines when it enlists state power. Even police departments quietly reviewed their policies on assisting HOAs after seeing the backlash against the deputies at Trevor's door. Training bulletins were issued reminding officers of the limits of their authority in civil matters. The small porch confrontation had triggered a wave of institutional reflection that no one could have imagined. Inside Palmetto Shores, the legal and legislative changes began to ripple before they were even passed. Residents demanded to review bylaws, sought refunds of disputed fines, and elected interim leaders to replace Judith's ally. Workshops on homeowners' rights were held in the clubhouse, featuring lawyers and legislators who only months before would never have been invited. Trevor attended but sat off to the side, watching as his neighbors spoke with a confidence that had once seemed impossible. The shift from fear to agency was palpable. People who had once whispered complaints now openly debated policy changes, circulating draft amendments to the covenants, and planning for new elections under the eye of the state monitor. The reforms taking shape in the Capitol were mirrored by reforms on the ground. The story of Palmetto Shores appeared in national magazines as an emblem of how a small incident could expose a larger democratic deficit in everyday life. Commentators compared it to other moments when ordinary people unintentionally sparked change. Parents fighting for school bus safety, workers challenging unfair schedules, residents demanding clean water. In that lineage, the lake cabin became a symbol, a modest, weathered porch where private power was confronted and the state's highest legal officer stepped in, setting off a chain reaction of scrutiny, lawmaking, and empowerment. The Attorney General, once known mainly for corporate lawsuits, became identified with homeowners' rights, giving speeches about the need for balance between property values and civil liberties. National organizations studying HOAs cited the South Carolina reforms as a model for other states. At Palmetto Shores, the reforms also forced a reckoning with the board's finances. Auditors appointed by the court uncovered misallocated funds and questionable contracts tied to Judith's tenure. These findings added fuel to legislative proposals to require annual independent audits of all HOAs above a certain size. Lawmakers included whistleblower protections for board members who reported misconduct, directly inspired by those who had leaked emails during the investigation. By the time the legislative session ended, a suite of bills had passed with bipartisan support, fundamentally altering how HOAs operated in South Carolina. Residents received notices explaining their new rights and procedures. Training seminars for board members were rolled out statewide. The system that had once allowed Judith to act unchecked was now circumscribed by transparency, accountability, and clear limits on enforcement. As the legal dust settled, the atmosphere at Palmetto Shores slowly shifted from confrontation to reconstruction. The clubhouse that had hosted angry meetings became a space for planning block parties, volunteer cleanups, and collaborative discussions about how to rewrite the community's rules to reflect shared values rather than unilateral control. Formerly silent neighbors introduced themselves to one another at these gatherings, trading stories not of fines and warnings, but of gardens, fishing spots, and family milestones. The election of a new board brought in a mix of longtime residents and newer homeowners who pledged to run the HOA transparently. They posted agendas and budgets online, opened committee meetings to the public, and created a mediation process for dispute. Trevor, though still wary of the spotlight, accepted a modest role on a committee focused on revising the covenants. He brought his meticulous notes to help ensure that any new rules would be clear, fair, and enforceable without intimidation. Other residents who had once been targets of selective enforcement volunteered as well, determined to transform the association into something cooperative rather than punitive. This collaborative effort began to rebuild the sense of community that had eroded under Judith's reign. People who had once crossed the street to avoid each other now shared coffee after meetings, discovered common interests, and even organized a community garden on a previously unused lot. The return of trust was not instant or effortless. Some wounds ran deep. Certain homeowners remained skeptical, keeping boxes of old letters as reminders of what had happened. But the visible changes helped. No more deputies at doorsteps. No more surprise warnings without process. No more secretive board sessions. When disagreements arose, they were handled through mediation rather than confrontation. The tone of neighborhood emails softened, shifting from threats of fines to invitations for input. Even small gestures, like sending birthday cards to elderly residents or hosting welcome dinners for newcomers, became symbolic acts of reclaiming a neighborly spirit. Media outlets that had once camped outside the gates occasionally returned to do after-story. They found a community in the midst of healing, not yet perfect, but markedly different from the fearful, divided place it had been. Articles highlighted how residents had turned outrage into organization, how reforms at the state level had empowered them to take control of their own governance, and how ordinary people could push back against abusive practices without descending into chaos. For many readers, Palmetto Shores was no longer just a cautionary tale, but an example of resilience. The ripple effects extended beyond the lake. Other neighborhoods invited Palmetto Shores residents to speak at their meetings about lessons learned. Community groups used the story in workshops about grassroots advocacy. Law students studied the case as a practical illustration of how private power intersects with public law. Through all of this, Trevor remained a soft-spoken presence, declining most media requests, but offering advice quietly to those who sought it. His porch, once the stage for a dramatic confrontation, became again a place of quiet evenings and slow sunsets. But now neighbors stopped by to chat, bringing fresh vegetables from the garden or asking about the next community cleanup. In this new environment, the HOA's purpose shifted from policing to supporting. Committees formed to help elderly residents with yard work, to coordinate lake safety measures, to plan festivals. Children played without parents worrying about citations for toys left outside. Longtime residents who had feared that reforms would lower property values instead found the opposite. Transparency and cooperation made the neighborhood more attractive. Real estate listings began to highlight not just the lake view, but the reformed and welcoming HOA. The transformation showed that order and fairness need not be at odds, that a community could protect its standards without sacrificing its soul. As months passed, the narrative arc that had begun with a tense standoff at a cabin evolved into something few would have predicted. A community once known for quiet compliance had become a laboratory of self-governance, influencing state law, inspiring others, and slowly mending its own fabric. The residents of Palmetto Shores, once strangers bound only by property lines and restrictive covenants, were learning to be neighbors again, proving that even the most rigid rules can be rewritten when people choose collaboration over intimidation.